Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another bit of Total War, Warhammer 2, Quake Magic gameplay. This time around, I'm playing as the Force of Chaos against the Wood Elves on the map Pillar of Bone. And so obviously, there's quite a bit of issues that Chaos can potentially have with Wood Elves. They can of course kite you to death. They have decent infantry that can just kind of stand and tank and let their Wild Riders and fear and terror causing units to kind of break you down. They have a lot of AP missiles, all that sort of stuff, so definitely not the easiest matchup for the Force of Chaos, but also not the hardest. And so kind of just decided to build a comp that was hopefully going to be really wide, just kind of swarm the Wood Elves if they decide to go with kiting build, or even if they decide to go with a more conventional build to stand and fight. So my lord, I did bring Prince Sigvald. His biggest perk, of course, is that he's dirt cheap. He does have pretty solid melee stats all over, good armor, bronze shield. He does have, of course, 520 weapon strength. I do believe his shield actually got nerfed. I do believe it used to be silver. But otherwise, he's still very, very solid. And he does have auric armor to provide that regen. He's relatively mobile despite being on foot thanks to Strider. And then, of course, he does have standardized support his troops. Alongside him, I did bring a Chaos Sorcerer of Death, which I think is a solid choice, simply for the fact that he provides Fate of Buna as well as Spirit Leech, which are, of course, just useful spells. And if I need to nuke down a unit of Wild Riders or something like that, it could be very good. Frontline is very cheap here, a mix of Chaos Warriors, because obviously these guys with their silver shields and 100 armor are very tough nut to crack for a lot of the Wood Elf troops, whether they're missile armed or melee armed, and even against the armor-piercing units, they'll hold up pretty well thanks to their good melee defense. And they are mixed in with a bunch of Chaos Marauders. And the Chaos Marauders are dirt cheap. They're not particularly great at anything, but they do have fairly high melee attack, decent weapon strength, and they're pretty quick on their feet. 35 speed means that they can catch up to basically any normal Wood Elf infantry. And they can trade very cost efficiently with them just because there's a lot of them, and they've got fairly high HP and all that sort of stuff. And a lot of the AP that the Wood Elves will usually bring against Chaos is going to be wasted on Chaos Marauders. We also do have 2 units of Marauder Horsemen. These might seem like a strange pick given their short range and kind of the fact that they're very susceptible to a lot of the Wood Elf shooting, and but despite that, I think they're pretty decent. They do provide you, they can kind of break up Elven infantry on the charge, and they have a pretty solid charge bonus. They're pretty mobile at 90 speed, and if I need to poke down, say, dragons, or if I need to poke away at enemy flanks, perhaps Wildwood Rangers, something like that, they'll be decent at that as well, with their fairly high weapon strength and ammunition capacity. Finally, out on the flanks, 2 big strike forces of a knight as well as 4 Chaos Warhounds, or a knight and 2 Chaos Warhounds on each flank. Normal knights without the lances, because I really don't think the charge bonus is necessary. My opponent brings Wild Riders. I'm obviously not going to cycle charge them. Just being cheaper here is useful. I'm mostly bringing these guys for their sting power and for their raw power and long sort of melee, or to tank out enemy skirmishers. Anything except Way Watchers will struggle against, or Starfire Shafts will struggle against them. For my opponent, a pretty conventional sort of standard Wood Elf build. He does have a single unit of Glade Guard Starfire Shafts here. He doesn't, up in the sky, he does have a Glady with the usual Prey of Anathema, Ire of Kurnus, Branch Wraith with Earthblood. Interestingly enough, and I think this is a bit of a strange pick, my opponent did bring Shield of Thorns, which I think is not really great against Chaos. Missile resistance won't really help you against most what Chaos brings. And weapon damage, one of the things I think people don't realize is that it only applies to non-AP. So with this sort of front line that's a mob of Eternal Guard, Wildwood Rangers, Azrai Spears, the weapon damage boost won't really apply. It's not really going to do very much for any of these units. At max, it'll be like a 1 or 2 point difference, because most of their damage is AP rather than normal. And then finally, my opponent did bring the Withering, which is definitely a pretty solid choice, though once again, with all this AP fire, a bit overkill. Frontline composed entirely of War Dancers, Azrai Spears, and Eternal Guard with shields. Very solid front line, honestly. They can tank out against Chaos Warriors, though obviously if I had brought Forsaken, and against the Chaos Marauders, they'll definitely struggle. Out on the flank, my opponent does have a unit of Sisters of Thorn, Way Watchers, and finally a unit of Glade Guard, or Glade Riders with Hagbane Tips, and these guys can definitely form a sort of powerful skirmish contingent, just to be a major nuisance to me. So you can definitely do a decent amount of damage. And of course, my Chaos Warhounds cannot actually catch Glade Riders with Hagbane Tips. They're actually far too slow. So you can see I'm doing a little bit of maneuvering there just to fade the fire. And you can see my opponent immediately shifts fire over here onto my Chaos Sorcerer of Death. And I'm going to make a serious mistake here in allowing him to get killed, because he does overextend, of course, being mounted on a horse. Over on the flanks, though, in the meantime, I'm going to start ordering my Marauder Horsemen to start peppering away. And you can see the Glady is already taking quite a bit of a beating here from that focused fire from the Javelins, despite her fairly high missile resistance. I do believe her missile resistance is sitting somewhere around 50%. If we can look, it's 25% missile resistance, 50% physical resistance. So definitely very solid. And in the meantime, you can see my Chaos Warriors, my Chaos Marauders just plowing into my opponent's front line. Now, I make a huge mistake, as mentioned before here. The Chaos Sorcerer of Death gets surrounded by Azrai Spears and is getting slaughtered, and I don't pay attention to him. And this was a huge mistake, and I basically lose my Chaos Sorcerer for nothing. On the flanks, though, my Warhounds are doing a great job simply zoning my enemies away. You can see this Thorn here being chased by Chaos Marauders, which is a huge waste. Over here, the Azrai Spear is getting swamped by Chaos Marauders, and this is going to allow my Knights to really kind of take my opponent's flank to Pound Town here and start collapsing on these troops. I'm trying to pepper down these Wildwood Rangers. You can see the Javs still going up top into the Glady and peppering her away. And obviously, my opponent is going to be able to zone away my troops and kind of keep me off his shooting. But you can see already he's wasted about half the ammo on his, or actually, maybe not half, probably about a quarter to 30% of his ammo on the Way Watchers. And obviously, once they're out of ammo, and as I take off models, they're going to be much less effective. So every little bit helps here. My opponent just has so many Warhounds to deal with. He's not really able to cover all of his flanks. These Marauders just pushing in. Obviously, I'm not expecting them to win or even do any damage. They're simply there to pressure my opponent and make him waste ammunition. Over here in the pits, though, Prince Sigvald is tanking things out, providing those buffs to my troops. Obviously, the Chaos Knights are not doing too great here, just because, of course, my opponent has very solid sort of damage going out. You can see my opponent does hit Sigvald with the Withering, which is a bit of a waste, because Sigvald's fairly tanky anyway, and he's not stationary right now, so it's hard to hit for those archers. Over here, though, you can see the Chaos Knights slowly but surely chipping away, though. As you can see, against the Eternal Guard, they do start taking a bit of a beating, and I'm going to be forced to pull them away. Over here, the skirmishers are picking away at some of the enemy troops, at some of these Eternal Guard with shields, and slowly but surely just whittling them down. Now, the Mighty Wraith is in the pits here and definitely taking a bit of a beating. You can see an Arrow of Curtis going down, laying their smackdown on the riders, on the knights, as well as Sigvald. But by and large, my opponent's infantry is kind of falling apart. I'm figuring that once the front line breaks, I'm going to be able to win. Now, obviously, I've lost my Chaos Sorcerer of Death at this point. These Chaos Marauders over here are routing. This unit of Chaos Marauders and Chaos Warriors were actually kept out of the fight on accident, and I'm finally able to pull them in, which is going to really stiffen up my situation here. Because both of our infantry forces are very depleted, and my opponent's shooting is starting to run low on ammunition. These Way Watchers have finally hit about 50%. They're down to about a little over half their models, so they're in a very rough spot. And these Warhounds are coming in for another pass. Over here in the pits, you can see the War Dancers Azrai Spears finally getting beaten down by Chaos Warriors, who of course are a superior man. They're definitely superior to these guys in a straight up fight. The War Dancers Azrai Spears will definitely give them a good account of themselves. But of course, the Warhounds here are also providing good boost to the Chaos Warriors. I'm not entirely sure which would actually win in just a straight up fight. Though definitely for the cost efficiency, Chaos Warriors are much better. Over on the flank, the Eternal Guard kind of getting picked apart by the Chaos Warriors, Chaos Knights. You can see some over here, some of the Chaos Knights and Chaos Marauders have routed off. And my opponent could potentially rout these guys off if he got a Terror Bomb off with the Glady, but he's very focused over here on this fight. Popping a Shield of Thorns, once again, as we discussed before, not really all that useful. Just because most of these troops are not reliant on AP, and you can see the Eternal Guard, especially with the poison applied, are doing very little damage. And my opponent's troops just get picked apart by these Marauder Horsemen. Over here in the pits, you can see the Wildwood Rangers finally going to break, and with that, my opponent's main armor-piercing contingent is down. And that's really only leaving a handful of troops over here. These Chaos Knights pursuing the Hagbane tips. You can see the unit flag is all the way over here, but the Knights are all the way over here chasing the Hagbanes, but the Hagbanes are almost out of ammo. And though the Chaos Knights can never really catch them, they can obviously keep pressuring them and wasting their time. And the more ammo they waste on the Sisters of Thorn units like that, the better situation I'll be in. In the pits here, my opponent's infantry is definitely kind of snapping it, because Marauders are so fast. All these Eternal Guard and potentially even the Branch Wraith if I get Sigvald on it, and a lot of these troops I'll be able to actually beat up with my infantry and just chase down. I'll be able to use my Marauder Horsemen to chase them down, mop them up, and kind of get my opponent's strongest troops off the field and really make things a lot easier for myself. Of course, my opponent is debuffing my Chaos Knights, and actually my whole blob here with 3 Heroes of Honorair from the Sisters of the Thorn, so definitely good usage of that spell there. Definitely one of those things that these guys are good at, but as you can see, ammo is running low, and the Warhounds are still pursuing, and obviously the Warhounds do have scaly skin, so they have a slight resistance to missiles. They're fairly small targets, so definitely do a pretty good job there. These Glade Riders, you can see they actually do break here. They finally get caught by the Knights, get kind of penned into the corner, and they are going to break. Knights do cause fear, which is, I think, worth noting, and they do break those guys and force them off the map. So my opponent's definitely a bit of a pickle here. The Sisters of the Thorn are trying to screen for these Glade Guard, managed to shatter those Hounds, but still a very rough situation. And obviously there's not enough Starfire Shafts here to really change the tide. Down in the pits here, my opponent is trying to drop his Gladian into the fight, trying to cause some damage, but I do get a nice surround. And of course the Forest Dragon is very, very poorly armored, and with her melee defense is only 40, so against someone like Sigvald, especially with standard die going down, the dragon, especially once its charge bonus is expended, it's not going to have a good day. You can see here I'm trying to harry it and run it down with the Marauder Horseman, but my opponent does charge in with the Sisters of Thorn just to buy himself some time. But really now we can throw things in fast forward. You can see over here the Marauder Horseman wiping out the Azrai Spears, as my opponent's army really does fall apart. I do peck away at the Glady here a little bit with the Javelins. You can see they're still doing pretty good damage before my opponent's army does shatter. So, despite being a rather, in some ways, botched game, for myself, I definitely made a huge mistake losing the Chaos Sorcerer of Death almost immediately, and that was simply because he was in the main group with the infantry, and I just kind of A-moved, and then I was focused on micro on the flanks. That was a major mistake, and that cost me the Chaos Sorcerer for no real gain. And I didn't even get a Fit of Buna. Fit of Buna on, for example, the Wild Rangers or one of the War Dancers could have actually made a huge difference in that game, just because those units were actually kind of the thing that was really keeping my opponent's army afloat, and had they been broken and just kind of shattered, that would make it a huge boon. So definitely a huge mistake there on my part. Otherwise, I think this build kind of came out on top against the Wood Elves. Obviously, if they brought something like Treekin or Durthu especially, things could have been a little rougher. I didn't have too much AP going in. Actually, I didn't have any units with AP whatsoever. I would have definitely relied kind of on mobbing them and swamping them in the pits. Though obviously, had I've been more careful with my Sorcerer, I could have always used Spirit Leech, and Sigvald's a decent duelist, as we discussed before. But definitely got massive value of the Marauders for what they were. They were simply chasing units off the field. They were able to beat down the Eternal Guard in a pretty cost-efficient manner. You can see the kill counts here, pretty comparable, and these guys are much, much cheaper. The Chaos Warriors, of course, did an okay job just anchoring the front, slugging it out with the War Dancers and the more expensive Wildwood Rangers. And the Knights, once again, it's important to keep in mind that my opponent's army was much smaller than mine, so despite not really impressive kill counts on any of these units, they're making a significant contribution. Those Marauder Horsemen definitely had a great time shooting at the Glady and pressuring my opponent's backline troops and the Wildwood Rangers and that sort of stuff. And the Hounds, of course, were really MVPs in this game, chasing off my opponent's main skirmish force. You can see these Way Watchers, Glade Riders, and Sister of the Thorn did rake in a bunch of kills, but it's important to keep in mind that many, if not most of those kills, were against low-value targets. 50 Marauders or 50 Chaos Warhounds is that's about 200 to 300 gold, maybe even less in the case of the Marauders. It's a very, very small amount of gain, and I was just able to kind of oversaturate my opponent's backline and collapse it. In my opinion, this is a fairly conventional, I think, Wood Elf build. I definitely think there's some things here that are a bit unnecessary. I think the Glade Riders and the Sister of the Thorn, definitely the duo is not necessary. I actually don't think the Sister of the Thorn are too great in the Chaos matchup. Their poke damage isn't too good, and despite the fact that Chaos can't really contest you too effectively, and they're pretty expensive, and as I discussed before, the Shield of Thorns is not particularly great against when you're building an AP-oriented army and obviously with Chaos' general lack of missiles. Obviously here I had 2 Marauder Horsemen. Chaos might bring a few Horsemen, just to skirmish away dragons or stuff like that, but honestly, you don't need the Shield of Thorns. It's basically useless, and then stacked on top of that, you only really get the Curse of Honor, but the Sister of the Thorn are a really lackluster unit otherwise, as far as the combat stats go. Otherwise, I think it's a pretty reasonable build. I don't really think there's too much else I can remark. I personally am more of a fan of more of a stand your ground and slug it out sort of Wood Elf build. Oftentimes I completely drop cavalry and try to get by with just a bunch of Starfire Shafts and bringing additional War Dancers to screen the flanks. Personally, I'm a bigger fan of those sorts of strategies, but this is, I think, in general, a pretty functional strat. Definitely a great game to my opponent. I definitely had a lot of fun. And yeah, it was kind of intense. It was kind of fun to just test out this sort of chaos build, just to sort of inundate your opponent with mob. I do hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below. If you have any comments or criticisms, be sure to share those, and I'll respond as soon as I can, as usual. I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.